This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Jo Youle. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. And this month, we dive into what would happen if we make crimes against the earth liable to criminal prosecution. More than a decade ago, a determined, passionate, courageous woman by the name of Holly Higgins defined the term ecocide as extensive damage to such an extent that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants of that territory has been or will be severely diminished. Since then, we've witnessed atrocities to the earth that committed by one human to another human would be punishable by lifetimes in jail. So we ask in today's show, what is the difference, and should the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court that currently lists 4 crimes be extended to include a 5th, that of ecocide? Unlike suing and fining corporations who pretty much gamble on being caught and put budget aside for exactly that, making ecocide a crime creates an arrestable offence. It directly makes those who are responsible for funding, permitting, or causing severe environmental harm liable to criminal prosecution. Now, at this point, I'm going to slide in a little quote from Polly, because before she very sadly left these lands almost 2 years ago, she said, "The rules of our world are laws and they can be changed. Laws can restrict or they can enable. What matters is what they serve. Many of the laws in our world serve property. They're based on ownership. But imagine a law that has a higher moral authority, a law that puts people and our planet first. Imagine a law that starts from first, do no harm, and that stops this dangerous game and takes us to a place of safety." Now, that quote comes from 2015 and really struck a chord with me, mainly because her passion to stop the Earth's destruction forced her to quit the day job as a high-powered, very well-paid barrister and become a defender of the Earth, creating a full-blown campaign to stop ecocide together with her co-founder, best friend and comrade Jojo Mehta, who we're talking to today. Jojo, thank you so much for joining us here on today's episode of the Gang of Witches podcast.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here, really. Thank you for having me on.
Jojo, I'm really grateful for you for making the time, because I know, how busy things are in the campaign right now, with a lot of new developments only in the last week, which I can't wait to get into shortly. But I'd love to start at the beginning, if I may, and ask how you and Polly actually met and became friends to embark on this journey together to where you stand now as the driving force and co-founder and executive director of the Stop Ecocide campaign.
Gosh, well, I first met Polly in 2014. I'd encountered her sort of in the sense that I'd read about her previously. And I remember when I first read about this whole concept of criminalizing mass damage to the earth, so making ecocide a crime, I remember thinking, wow, that sounds like the biggest game in town. What a really good idea. And it never occurred to me at that time that I would end up meeting her and working with her. But I moved back with my family to the beautiful area of the Cotswolds in England in 2011, having lived in London for a long time. And Polly herself moved to this area in 2014, and we had mutual friends. At the time, I was very involved in kind of quite on the ground activism around fracking. So I was involved in the anti-fracking community in the UK and had done a lot of research and sort of background digging around how that worked and how polluting it was. And at the time, when Polly had just moved, she was researching a possible case around fracking. And these mutual friends said, well, you must talk to Jojo because she knows all about that. And we kind of had a couple of meetings and just got on like a house on fire instantly. It was one of those kind of kindred spirit moments. And we actually very quickly started working together. And I worked with her very closely right up until she died in 2019.
It's clear Polly was and still is such a huge force alongside you in this whole campaign. And I'm guessing there must be days you just, feel like you really want to talk to her, especially when you're so close to your shared goal. It must be incredibly hard on those days of triumph, I guess, like especially not to be in this together now.
It's interesting, actually. I mean, we founded this together in 2017, the public facing campaign. And at the time, we thought of it as, well, there was sort of a couple of things that were wrapped up in that. One was a sort of a wish to also support activists, because part of the structure of the campaign was done to do that, to provide them with a document that they could use to support what they were doing, to say that they weren't behaving as criminals, but as conscientious protectors. So that was one side. But a very large part of it was actually also because over the years, Polly had found it very difficult to find foundation funding for the diplomatic work. It was considered a bit left field, a bit extreme, and also, of course, you know, when you're working on something that ultimately the result isn't in your hands, it was ultimately up to states to move this forward. That's, you know, it's not an easy thing for a sort of funding foundation to get behind, particularly when it's not sort of hugely well known. So a lot of the reason behind the public campaign was that we knew that people on the ground had a really good understanding of why this was important. And so we thought, well, we're going to need to crowdfund to carry on this work. And I came from obviously the campaigning side, she came from the legal side, and that's how we sort of joined forces to create this campaign. And it's moved on hugely since she passed away. And of course, there are times when, you know, I just, you know, would love her to be able to be here to see, you know, where things have developed. But it was kind of interesting how that happened, because I remember when she was first diagnosed with terminal cancer, which happened almost exactly 2 years ago. We received an awful lot of messages, obviously, people very sad and shocked and wondering what would happen to the work, you know, if she died. And they were worried, I think, that it would die with her because she was such a strong figurehead for this work. But actually, it was very interesting what happened, because when she actually did finally depart, which was sadly really quite fast, I started to receive different kinds of messages. So I started to receive messages from people saying, how can we help you, Jojo? How can we make sure that this actually happens, and taking it forward? So it was almost as if before that, people had kind of felt that, you know, this was her, you know, was her work, and therefore she had it, you know, she had it all under control, and, you know, oh, that Polly's doing that, so I don't have to do anything, kind of thing. Whereas when she was no longer there was this really strong sense, this kind of upsurge of support of people kind of saying, well, we need to make sure this does happen. So how can we help you? And so over the last couple of years, it's been a kind of a massive dot joining exercise on one level, where, you know, discovering how many other campaigns, how many lawyers, how many politicians were actually behind and really sort of wanting to take this forward, and sort of bringing all of that together. So it's been a massive exercise in collaboration and kind of, you know, coordination and consolidation. And there's no doubt that it feels like her spirit is absolutely with it. And, you know, that said, she's buried in this beautiful little churchyard not far from Stroud, which is where I still live. And it's the same churchyard where the writer Laurie Lee is buried in Slad. And it's very beautiful. But I don't go there very often. And that's partly because for me, I don't feel like that's where she is. I feel like, you know, her spirit is somehow is kind of with the campaign on a very kind of global level in a way. But I have to say that just the other day, I did actually go there. And it was when an article came out just a couple of weeks ago in The Economist magazine. And that was a real moment for me, because The Economist, as you know, is a pretty conventional publication with a pretty conventional readership. And it was also, the way that it was reported was brilliant. It was really sort of spot on and captured what we were doing, and the whole kind of movement and the, you know, the growing conversation. And I think it was one of those moments where I kind of felt it was almost like, you know, when you're watching a movie and, you know, some people cry when somebody dies in the movie. I'm the one that cries when the long-awaited reinforcements arrive. And the feeling was a bit like that. It was like, okay, this conversation has now hit the mainstream. And there was this incredible sense of relief. I actually got quite weepy in a way that I hadn't done when she died, because there was just so much to do. And it was almost like I didn't have time to. So I actually went to visit her grave and told her about it. And that was, it was quite a moment for me.
I'm not surprised. I mean, you know, what you have achieved, well, obviously when Polly was here, but equally since her passing, it feels like it's really gathering momentum. And that's a really beautiful moment, that this is really beginning to seriously become a thing. Not that it wasn't before, but it's like, you know, it's seriously on the cusp of landing, which is epic. And I was listening to the part of her last book, Dare to be Great, being read by her husband, Ian, on the launch video on your website. And I also watched her TEDx talk today at Whitechapel, which I just like, I loved it so much, with, you know, the fake forest shipped in onto the stage and the moss as she was sort of walking around barefoot as well, because you can really, I think, feel the importance of her legacy in those words and how it really needs to be fully completed with this law being created and obviously enforced. So I think it'd be, really nice as you've reached this point, if you could sort of tell us in your own words, maybe in layman's terms about this law as being the terminology that we can actually wrap our heads around it.
Yes, absolutely. So, it's kind of what do we mean by ecocide, I guess, is the place to start. And the simplest explanation is destruction of ecosystems, in the same way that homicide is killing a person and genocide is destroying a people. Ecocide, in the sense of mass damage and destruction of ecosystems, which is probably the sort of broad understanding of it, that has been happening. That serious harm to nature has been happening for decades, and it's been happening repeatedly and relentlessly at the hands of some of the biggest corporations. Unlike genocide, for the most part, it is still permitted by law. A simple way to explain that is that you can't, for example, go to a government and ask for a permit to slaughter a whole bunch of people for your new business, and just say, well, it's going to be great for jobs. It's criminal and you can't do it. But you can go and get a license to open a mine. You can get a license to frack for oil and gas. You can get a license for industrial fishing. And, some of those, fishing techniques involve destroying entire swathes of the seabed. So, and then other kinds of arenas like, destroying soils with pesticides, the same with insect ecosystems, and of course, chopping down rainforests. So many of these practices are either tolerated or licensed. So effectively, there's not that guardrail in place that's needed. And we tend to draw the line in our culture. We tend to draw the line between what's sort of morally acceptable and not, using criminal law. So at the moment, destruction of nature just doesn't actually sit below that line. We don't have the same horror of it as we do with people. And that is partly, I believe, due to a long history, literally hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of a kind of separation especially in the Western mindset. It doesn't cover everybody. Obviously, there are indigenous cultures that really completely feel themselves to be part of nature, so much so that they don't even really talk about nature because it's all related. But here in the West, and of course we have the kind of global dominant thinking, and that is partly because the way we think has that sort of separate, dominating, controlling aspect. And I think that runs right back to Plato, ideal versus the real, Catholic Church, spirit versus the body, Enlightenment, reason versus nature. That dualism just runs right through Western history. So obviously you can blame people for having that perspective, and the way that we focus on the growth of the economy and the domination and extraction of nature, but in a sense, it's like that's so deeply embedded in our history that it's not surprising that we've ended up at this point, if you like. But there's something about the possibility of criminalizing ecocide that kind of brings destruction of nature onto a par with destruction of human beings. It's not just about the literal law, which obviously is very important because you're potentially creating a deterrent that isn't currently in place. And I can come back to that in terms of comparing it with kind of laws we do have already. But I think one of the really key things to look at is also the sort of cultural shift or the moral impact of going for this at the international level as we're doing. Because if you're saying that destroying nature is an atrocity level crime, then you're effectively reinforcing any sort of environmental regulations or lesser environmental laws that are in place, because you're shifting that whole mentality. So you're basically having people take that a lot more seriously, but also potentially even shifting maybe people towards understanding better the interdependence between humanity and our precious life support systems, that we're not somehow, we're not separate, we're deeply, deeply intertwined and dependent on all of those systems. And you'd be amazed how many times you kind of need to remind people, what do you think you're breathing? What do you think you're drinking? What do you think you're eating? It's like, all of this is so directly wrapped up in how we treat the world around us. So there is something quite sort of fundamental and cultural and moral about, bringing this extra rule in place, if you like. And I suppose I would just kind of go on to compare it to the environmental regulation situation that we currently have that you did touch on in your introduction. At the moment, as you said, corporations will kind of budget for changes in regulation, but they don't change their behaviour. And to use a bit of a brutal analogy, which I sometimes do, is it's a bit like, so beating up your wife, giving her some pocket money or buying her some nice clothes and then carrying on beating her up. It's the abuse doesn't stop stop just because you compensate something. And the difference with a criminal law is that you're actually creating individual personal criminal responsibility. So, instead of you being able to kind of hide behind the corporate veil and it allow the company to sort of take the rap with maybe a fine or a rap on the knuckles, so to speak, as a key decision maker, you're going to actually be asking yourself, do I want to find myself in the same position as a war criminal? Is that really how I want to be seen? And actually, for corporate players, it makes a huge difference because they care what people think of them because their share price depends on it. So, even if it's just from a kind of business perspective, if you like, making ecocide into a crime has a kind of potentially a stronger deterrent effect than some of the other atrocity crimes, because as a corporate player, you care very much about your public image.
It's so interesting what you say there about the corporate image, and obviously making these people accountable by kind of hitting them where it hurts, essentially by destroying their public image and their the perception that people have of them as corporate players, and their kind of economical impact is obviously going to be directly affected. 2 episodes ago, we had Sandra Benveniste from the Ibiza Preservation, and she was saying that the success stories that she's had specifically on Ibiza with the work that they've done and they've implemented to stop, big oil companies coming and drilling and doing prospective recce, that's the word I'm looking for. They go to check out if there's any oil in the vicinity. And she said, those projects have only worked because, they've teamed up with corporate big clients and tourism giants on the island, because ultimately, you can't attract tourism to this island unless those partnerships are put in place. But I guess what you're doing is obviously slightly different and obviously going to be hopefully far more effective. But it's kind of interesting to look at that from the perspective of, how that's going to directly impact their image.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also brings in another aspect of, how one goes about bringing this recognition in criminal law, because criminal law doesn't act retrospectively. I mean, generally speaking, when you bring in a new law, it applies from when it comes in. That's actually quite important in this context because, we're looking at a global situation of emergency here. We're looking at, a crisis of planetary proportions in terms of what's happening to our ecosystems and how that's ultimately going to affect human civilization in the not terribly distant future. And it's already affecting a number of populations right now. So this is a kind of, this is a global thing, and it needs to be approached internationally, but it also needs to be approached by everybody. So what we can't afford to do is bring it in overnight, because actually corporations and politicians as well, the political and corporate sectors, and indeed the legal sector, just wouldn't be able to cope if this happened very, very quickly. So there actually needs to be a kind of a transition period. Not too long, clearly, because we don't have long. But at the same time, it's a balance between, if you tried to do this overnight. And it's interesting, actually, because you can see a bit how this is playing out in France at the moment, which is a bit of a pilot case. President Macron has very vocally supported the idea of an international crime of ecocide, and has been a little bit more reluctant to legislate nationally. And they've just in France voted through part of the process of voting through a law of supposedly of ecocide, but it's been watered down quite a lot to be just a kind of a misdemeanor that's actually not particularly easily enforceable. And I think what this shows is that politically speaking, there's a different feeling around legislating nationally, because that potentially happens quite quickly and it affects your own economic sector very sort of or potentially instantly, and you don't want to stick your neck out as a government to be the first one on the block. But internationally, it's safer politically to back that, because it can't happen instantly, because that you've got to have a whole bunch of countries with you for it to work, for it to move forward, and also that takes a certain amount of time, and the procedure to do it takes a certain amount of time. And in fact, from our perspective, that's exactly how you do want to do it, because firstly, if you do it at the international level, then you end up with a coherent law across borders, which is important because the biggest polluters are transnational corporations. But also you end up with almost a kind of automatic transition period, because it takes a certain amount of time, and it's like everyone can see it coming. So they kind of know that they need to adjust their practices. They know that they need to rethink the scale they're doing things on, the methods they're using, in order to potentially be able to comply with this law. Because of course, once it comes in, you can't insure a criminal activity. You can't easily finance a criminal activity either. So there's a kind of strong sense of, well, we're going to have to look at it before that day. And just, in a small way, that happened a couple of years ago with the data protection regulations. Everybody knew that they were coming in, and it's like, okay, so how do we comply with that thing? And that's the attitude that we need people to be taking, because we've just got to take everybody with us. This can't be a situation, much as, particularly as a former kind of on the ground activist, there are definitely some particular CEOs that, I'd quite like to see in the dock, but it's actually, ultimately, it's not about that. It's not about retribution. It's about preventing the harm. It's about putting something in place that actually has the practices change, which comes back to that analogy I was talking about with the abuse. Yes, of course you want justice, but ultimately what you want is for the abuse to stop. You want the practices to change. And that is something that it requires people to see it coming over the horizon. And that's, I think, beginning to happen now. It's beginning to happen now because that conversation is really starting to grow. So even though we haven't yet got to the stage where there's a state or a group of states actually proposing it, the conversation is really picking up pace and people are starting to kind of be aware of what it means. And I think just even that conversation in itself is already starting to sort of, make a bit of a shift.
You're saying to me that this is obviously very urgent. And I think that this is like the number one thing that I love about what, Greta Thunberg, she really sort of rams that point home. Like, at the moment, I love the way that she puts this whole situation into such eloquence at such a young age. But, it's interesting what you're saying there about the fact that it's extremely urgent. This is a crisis. It needs to be dealt with immediately, but yet it can't be brought in overnight. That's kind of an interesting thing to observe, that there is a sort of like a bit of a pause that also needs to happen for everybody to catch up and get this sort of going on at the same time, which I hadn't really considered before, because obviously you would just think that you want it to happen as fast as humanly possible. But I mean, what is the timeline for this? I got very excited when I saw the breaking news on the weekend with the France announcement, but I wasn't really sure what that actually meant for the wider picture globally.
We kind of estimate around 5 years in order to make this change at the level of international law. Now, the last time that the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the International Criminal Court, the last time that document was amended, at least the last time a new crime was added, it was the crime of aggression, and that took between 7 and 10 years. However, we think that we're in a rather different climate now, in the sense, both politically and literally, in the sense that there is very much a sort of strong external sense of urgency around this issue. And one of the things that, as a campaign, Stop Ecocide International is aiming to do is really to expand the conversation around ecocide. And we're not particularly hung up on it being our specific campaign either. It's just about this conversation around ecocide, is getting that conversation loud enough and helping to move governments into a position which, to be honest, I mean, we feel that it's approaching. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I don't think it's going to be very long before governments will be embarrassed to be seen saying they don't want to address this. And that's actually all we need. Because, so long as we've got, I mean, obviously sort of in the more sort of on the diplomatic sense, and, obviously I'm not able to divulge all of those kinds of conversations because they often happen behind closed doors. But effectively, what we're aiming for is for a small group of states to potentially move forward with this. And we don't necessarily need everybody to be saying, yes, we really actively want this. We need them to be too darn embarrassed to say we don't want this. And I don't actually think we're terribly far off that point. I mean, especially with reports coming out like the latest UNFCCC report that came out a couple of weeks ago, saying that, with the current, nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that the countries have to give as to how their ambitions and commitments with relation to the Paris Agreement. The latest report said that at the current levels of commitment, we'd be looking at reducing emissions by 1% by 2030, when it needs to be at least 45% in order to have any hope of meeting the Paris goals longer term. And when something like that is happening, it's very clear that there's some kind of parameter or kind of factor that is needed to really help governments and corporations, to kind of move towards the right, move in the right direction, to put a kind of guardrail around activity so that it's like, no, actually beyond this, we can't go because it's simply not working. And I don't understand myself. I can't imagine how, UN Sustainable Development Goals have any chance of being reached unless some kind of enforceable parameter like this is put in place. I mean, we don't kid ourselves that ecocide law is going to fix everything, but at the same time, without something like this, it's very difficult to see how we're really going to be able to move forward into a future that is livable in. So it's kind of it's not the only piece, but it's a very key piece. It's like a kind of key bridging piece to sort of get to a position where we can actually, start moving in the right direction. I mean, it's also going to be, there's plenty of people in the kind of corporate sustainability arena, I suppose, who would love to have something like this in place. I think a lot of CEOs actually would really like to see something like this in place, and it's actually a tool to be able to say to their shareholders, no, we can't do that anymore just because it's the cheapest, dirtiest thing. We actually have to do this other thing because otherwise we're actually going to be breaking the law. So instead of looking at, all of those little technical workarounds that they pay their corporate lawyers however many, hundreds of millions to sort of work around, you've actually got a kind of different baseline where you just have to say, well, actually, we can't do that because that level of damage is criminal. It's how to sort of create that sort of bridging moment. And we feel that that's what this law has the potential to do.
I was interested in when I was checking out the background really of the ICC. I mean, someone who's not a lawyer, I'm not on the same page as you. I'm still kind of learning a lot from reading about you and Polly's work. And I was obviously interested in the fact that it's located in The Hague, for example, where all those big important places are in the European Union. But I feel like it was sort of saying under one of the documents that I was reading before this interview was that America and a few other countries don't even recognize the ICC. So if this was made a law at, the International Criminal Court or brought it in, would that mean that those countries that don't, I think it was 21 countries that don't even acknowledge the fact that the ICC is even a thing? I mean, I don't even understand how they can just vote or opt out of acknowledging that these laws become laws. But as Polly said, rules are there to be broken, kind of, potentially.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, America is a particular case in point at the moment because, obviously under Trump, they even imposed sanctions on people from the ICC, which is just kind of horrific, really. The idea of doing that against an international judicial body. I mean, just outrageous, actually. But I think that when a law is approved at the International Criminal Court and ratified there, it actually has a broader applicability than you might think. I mean, it's certainly true that any country that doesn't ratify the amendment won't have to apply it in its own jurisdiction, whereas the countries that ratify will have to incorporate it into their own domestic law. But what those countries that ratify can also do is they can arrest people from any country in the world for that crime, so long as they've ratified it and the person's on their territory. So you could have a situation, for example, where, I mean, I'm just going to pull this out of the air, but you could have, a US company committing ecocidal activity in, Venezuela, for example, and they've got an operational office in Brussels. If Belgium ratifies it, and Belgium's kind of a front runner in the sense that they've publicly expressed interest in this and it's in their government pledges. So let's say that Belgium ratifies the crime, they could then potentially arrest someone in Belgium and prosecute them for it there. And it doesn't have to be the perpetrator. It could be, the connection just needs to be there. It could be that the victims are in Belgium. It could be that something to do with, the operations of the companies in Belgium. There are probably various different ways that it could be applied. So in a way, what you're doing is you're giving prosecutors and the potential to broaden their scope of where prosecutions can take place and how. And at the moment, with a crime like war crimes, for example, if you're a war criminal, your own state is probably not going to be in a position to prosecute you. And so you're going to, if anything, end up in the court of last resort, which is at The Hague, which is the International Criminal Court. But with ecocide, because it's mostly a corporate crime, I mean, potentially somebody could be prosecuted in any ratifying jurisdiction. So it does create it's by no means perfect, but it certainly creates a broader scope than you might initially think by the fact that not everyone's signed up to the ICC. Does that make sense?
It does. It totally makes sense. It's just an interesting concept. I didn't realise, depending on where the headquarters are, depending on where the actual action or ecocide is actually occurring. It's interesting to say, as you said, that if then the perpetrator was in Belgium, then that could then obviously be tried there, or would it need to be tried at the ICC?
No, I mean, the way that the ICC is set up, it's actually intended to be a court of last resort. So it's only intended to actually prosecute there if a national jurisdiction can't or won't. So, and as I said, with a situation of something like war crimes, the likelihood is that a relevant national jurisdiction might not want to or be able to. But with ecocide, they could in many instances. I mean, if you're talking about accusing a head of state, then yes, it would be the ICC itself. You couldn't get away from that. And that, for example, would be the case with quite a recent filing against Jair Bolsonaro under crimes against humanity from an indigenous chief, Chief Raoni, in Brazil via French lawyers. Now, actually, Chief Raoni wanted to accuse him of ecocide, but ecocide is not yet on that statute. So what the filings actually against crimes about crimes against humanity and aspects of persecution of the indigenous communities that fall under crimes against humanity, but which ultimately came from ecocidal activities. If ecocide had been in place, it would have been, bang in that ballpark, if you see what I mean. So it's an interesting case for that reason, actually.
That's exactly what I was about to move on to, actually, because I think that's, brilliant. I mean, amazing news. But as you say, it's not quite ready to go. But I think, what about this stuff about, does that include the fact that he was obviously sort of causing these massive forest fires in the Amazon? Or was that, when you say crimes against humanity, I mean, assuming that comes under that umbrella?
Yeah, that has to be, it has to fall under sort of specific aspects of the crimes against humanity definitions, like, for example, forced displacement of people would be one. That's quite a sort of obvious one, I suppose, in that context, but there were probably others. I'm not going to list them exactly because I haven't got the communication right in front of me, otherwise I could. But certainly there's the way that crimes against humanity is set out is there's a sort of list of possible crimes, and so long as they come under a kind of umbrella, what's known as a chapeau in the legal jargon, which is a kind of overarching definition which says any of the below acts when committed as part of a systemic attack on a civilian population. So that's what takes it above just those individual crimes, which might be murders, or they might be torture, or they might be whatever, but if they form part of effectively what could be argued to be a systematic attack or systemic attack, then that becomes crimes against humanity. So there's been enough of those kinds of activities to justify a filing under crimes against humanity, which is just horrific. But if ecocide had been in place already, then potentially it wouldn't have actually had to get that far before a filing could have taken place.
Once upon a time in Ibiza with Joanna Ruby.
If you ask me how she is these days, how can I lie? I suppose the last time you saw her was that early morning in May last year, when she, her sister and her 2 sons stood in the porche of the house they had defended to the last minute, Margarida's house. Of course, they hadn't defended it alone. In those final months, a tidal wave had come. People who had heard the story. They tell me it was in the New York Times. She would make coffee and sandwiches all morning for the swarms of people who made their way to San Jordi, to Margarida's house. Expropriation, I think, is the correct terminology for when a person sells their house to the state against their will. It's the terminology for when times simply change, and a motorway link to the airport becomes more important than a well-tended field of melons, beans and squash. More important than Margarida's house. Yes, the last time you saw her face was probably the 3rd of May, 2006, a drizzly early morning when they already stood proud in the porche, waiting for the bulldozers which came flanked with over 100 Guardia Civil. It's funny how the local paper put it, that things went very smoothly. They only had to forcefully remove 7 protesters from the site. Margarida, her sister, her sons and some neighbours from Margarida's house. So if you ask me how she is these days, how can I lie? I've been told that they move her from one son's house to another to keep things more manageable. I doubt you'll see her face again now. To be honest, I think she's slipping away. But let it be known, that they built a monument to Margalida's house. They wrote a song for Margalida's house. And when they destroyed it to build a roundabout, they immortalised it forever. Margalida's house. This is dedicated to Margalida Tor, whose house, a 19th century traditional Ibizan finca called Cama Paleva, was torn down by the authorities on the 3rd of May 2006 to build the new motorway linking San Antonio with Ibiza's airport. Margalida was said to have never recovered from the ordeal, and she died 6 years later almost exactly to the day. Cama Paleva has since become a national symbol for Spain's anti-motorway protest movement, and there is a memorial dedicated to the house in the village of San Jordi.
If this gets enforced and if this becomes law, then that will be 10 years in prison potentially and €4.5 million as a fine. Is that the maximum?
That, I believe, I think you're probably taking that from the recent French law, which is actually talks about, is really not talking about ecocide on the scale that we would imagine would be relevant at the International Criminal Court. It's talking about sort of serious pollution events and so on. And actually, it could be considerably, the sentencing would be yet to be worked out. I mean, as you probably know, we've convened a panel of top international criminal and environmental lawyers to draft a definition of ecocide that could fit into the Rome Statute and could be proposed by states. But that isn't even finished yet. That drafting process won't be complete until June. So, we don't yet have a kind of exact definition. And even then, you're going to it's a starting point for states in the sense that until it's actually in the statute, we won't be able to define exactly what it is. So, I mean, the sentencing guidelines for the French law may not be the same at the international level. I mean, you could be talking about anything up to a life sentence. You could be talking about massive fines. You could be talking about, ideally, you could also be talking about restorative justice. We have yet to see how that side of things will emerge. But I know that Polly particularly was particularly keen on the sentencing side of things, incorporating strong restorative provision, for example.
That sounds like a very impressive phrase and something that sounds very brilliant as a punishment, because obviously, how can you all of a sudden just replace massive amounts of forests in the Amazon? I mean, I'd love to see someone wave a magic wand. How would that actually happen? I'm intrigued.
Well, I think it would probably depend very much on the context. And of course, I would still fall back on the fact that ultimately we're not really looking to be restoring, we're looking to be preventing. But certainly, I think looking at restorative provision is going to be important in terms of, again, weirdly, having those kinds of provisions about helping to restore ecosystems in whatever way that would apply in a particular circumstance will in itself form part of the kind of deterrent effect. It's like, can you imagine if you're like, if I do this thing, not only am I risking jail, but I'm going to have to put it all back anywhere, somehow. Okay, that's a very crude way of describing it. But there's something about the linking of the destruction to restoration that, again, has a kind of mindset implication that I think is quite important. Yeah. But as I say, that's all a little bit further down the line than where we are now.
To play devil's advocate, you just kind of think, well, if all of that oil's already been taken and sold for, a couple of billion, like you can't put that oil back under the earth. You can't,
No, absolutely. Which is why it's hugely context dependent. But also, but what you could be looking at, for example, is cleanup operations. I mean, if you look at, Deepwater Horizon, for example, I mean, firstly, if had a law like this been in place, the safety protocols that were observed or were failed to be observed at that time could have played out very differently, because you might have been looking at very specific people, being blamed for that. So that's one aspect. But also the way that it happened, and this often happens in situations like oil spills, is that yes, the company might get fined, but the actual cleanup ends up falling onto the state where it's where the damage has happened, and often depends hugely on sort of local NGOs and volunteer operations, and all of that is hugely unfair, actually, if you think about it. And so looking at the kind of whether sentencing provision would include actually having to engage in that, in mitigating the damage that's been caused, and in cleaning up something like that, for example, would be an absolute no-brainer in terms of an approach to sentencing.
I mean, there's that chunk of Nigeria, isn't there, where there's a real pickle going on, to put it lightly. And I think what I loved the other day, and actually even brought a little tear to my eye, was these 13-year-old girls in Congo. And they basically, really took this oil company to action, to court, and they actually won. And there's a really big thing going on over there right now. It only happened a few weeks ago, and they're being paid out a lot of money. And also that company is being forced to clean up because it's been causing cancer and it's been going into the water, and people are dying there because of this absolute mess there. It's terrifying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's a really kind of textbook case of long-term ecocide in Nigeria. So I think you're probably referring to Ogoniland, and there have been a couple of legal rulings recently which have been really important. In that one was in Holland, and again about responsibility of actually the parent company, which was Shell, taking responsibility for its subsidiaries and effectively leaking pipelines and so on. And then there was another ruling in the UK even more recently, which has enabled Nigerian communities to take Shell to task in a UK court as well, which is something that the UK Supreme Court just judged as well. So there is progress happening in terms of litigation type contexts. But it's also, when you think about, had a law of ecocide been in place 20 years ago when the International Criminal Court was first set up, in fact, in the original drafting of the Rome Statute, there was something quite similar to, it was serious environmental crime was actually in there. It just never made it to the final draft. And can you imagine if it had, that situation in Ogoniland could have been very, very different. And so many other things around the world could potentially have been headed off at the pass.
That was back in, there was somebody that coined that term back in the 70s. Is that what you mean? It could have been brought in back then and we could have had 50 years of this.
Well, I actually meant with the Rome Statute, which is the end of the 90s, because that there was, but you're completely right. The first time the term was used was actually, I think it was 1970, by Arthur Galston, who was one of the people who helped to develop Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. And it was a defoliant that was used in Vietnam to a horrific effect that's still having awful effects now on the descendants of people from then. So really quite drastic. And it was first used on the international stage in 1972 at the UN Environment Conference in Stockholm, and that was Olof Palme, who was the leader of Sweden at the time, who talked about ecocide and actually using that word. But it was kind of, it's been in a sense kind of bubbling away in the background in terms of international legal developments over a number of decades. And in the 90s, there was a clause that was in the draft, which later became the Rome Statute, that would have covered serious damage and destruction to nature, but it didn't make it into the final statute. So when the Rome Statute was first ratified in 1998, it was done with just genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. But there could have been other aspects to that. So there could have been, like I say, at least 20 years of a different situation. Yeah.
Which would have been a massive game changer. And, look at even that David Attenborough documentary. I mean, I don't agree with all parts of it, but there are some parts where you just look at it and my mouth is just agape. It's just terrifying, really, the state of the things that we're in. We also like to talk about hope on this show and not completely go down the road of all the terrible atrocities. And it's very exciting what's happening now in your world. I mean, that this really feels like it is almost there. It's really feeling like a very positive moment in time, particularly, I guess, the current climate that we're in. It's, it is exciting. I mean, if this actually does get passed, I mean, what would that mean to you to actually get this law passed?
I think it'd be incredible, obviously. And I agree with you on the hope side of things. I mean, one of the things that's so beautiful about this campaign is that the number of light bulb moments we see in people's faces, because, there is so much despair around what's been happening on the planet. And so for people to hear that there is a possible, legal solution that is not only achievable, but is actually kind of approaching, which I would say, that's definitely, it's definitely en route now. It's just a question of time. But yeah, we don't think it's a question anymore of, whether. It's just a question of when. And yeah, so I suppose it's kind of, we actually almost, one of the inspiring things for us is actually seeing that in people's faces. It's this kind of, oh my God, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. This can actually, there is something that could actually start flipping this in a different direction. And so that is hugely encouraging. And also because it's not like the ICC in particular has an interesting structure. So it's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its members. So you ratify it there, you've got to put it in your own domestic legislation. And that's very different. And again, criminal law, very different to civil law. If someone, if it becomes a crime, it's like, I mean, in theory, at least, if you walk down the street and someone beats you up, you don't sue them. You go to the police, they get arrested and the state prosecutes. That's the arena you're going to be putting it into. So, I mean, in theory, you could, you'd be tapping a policeman on the shoulder going, there's an ecocide happening over there. Can you go and arrest them? I mean, in practice, it might be a little more complex than that, but that's the principle of the thing. And, the feeling that that's possible is obviously very inspiring, but also the mechanism for making it possible at the ICC is relatively straightforward in the sense that, any member state can propose it, a simple majority can put it on the table. But the important thing is that it's a one state, one vote forum, which is like the UN, but it doesn't have a Security Council. So nobody has a specific veto. So effectively, once you've kind of got it into the arena for discussion, it really is a question of accumulating the support. There's no one that can actually jump in and say, this shall not happen. I refuse to let this happen. So, there's a real achievability about it. And I think that is really inspiring and really encouraging.
I think it's quite interesting to note, particularly from your sort of Instagram campaign in the run up to International Women's Day, that you've got some very powerful women on board backing this campaign, like the Princess of Belgium, Princess Esmeralda, and Sian Sutherland, co-founder of Plastic Planet, Anna Ghia, and the list goes on of really, big names of kind of like, would you call them eco-feminists?
Well, possibly, yes. I mean, they're people who are sort of running their own, environmental NGOs and having a really big impact in their own particular areas, which is one of the reasons that, we felt it was a really nice campaign to run. But yes, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this work, and it's by no means exclusive, but there is certainly a tendency towards women really getting it. And certainly in terms of our team, we're very women heavy, and we have volunteers from all over the world and, all different kinds of people. But there is quite a heavy majority of women. And I think the other thing that's interesting is, and I do think this is partly a culturally embedded thing, possibly, but I often get a sense with women, or certainly the ones that we've worked with, that the ones who are willing to just really kind of jump in and kind of work to get the job done without having their own particular agendas or without having their own particular need for recognition or those kind of things, the majority are women. Not all, but most. And I think that's an interesting thing to observe. And, we do have men on the team who are absolutely fabulous. But yeah, the kind of, it's funny, Polly and I nearly put a sign on the door once of our office saying, if you've got baggage, leave it here or take it away. Because, when you're working on something like this, there just isn't room for ego, because, anybody that's in it for the recognition or, it just never works. I mean, there's been a few people fell by the wayside for that reason, or they just find that it's not fulfilling what they need, whether, I don't know, maybe they need the main stroking or whatever it is. But none of that works in this arena. If we want to get this thing done, it has to be a question of, kind of all hands on deck and, what's actually needed in a given moment. And you can't have, people's kind of personal baggage getting in the way of that. And if it does, inevitably, they kind of don't find the gratification or the, you know, the drama that maybe they might need for that. But so I mean, I have to say, I mean, I'm just hugely grateful for the incredible team we've got, because it is remarkably ego-free. You know, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we put out is, you know, a lot of what we do is about amplifying a conversation. So a lot of what we do is about the information that we put out, and who we put it out to, and all of those kinds of things. And the teams we've got, and we've got them in over a dozen countries now, we've got communications teams, but they're fantastic at just instantly responding and going, right, let's get that translated, let's get that out, let's get that, you know, and just really responding to when things come in. And because they're often external, we often don't dictate the developments, but we amplify them and we use them to kind of move the conversation on. But for example, if, you know, like, not that long ago, you know, Luxembourg making a statement that you know, they were ready to support ecocide, you know, legislating for ecocide when the time was right. It's like, oh, okay, another state has actually recorded an interest. We need to get that out right now. And it's like, drop everything. This is what's going out today. And yeah, the teams have always been fantastic.
It's interesting. I mean, we've talked about it quite a bit on this podcast with the powerful women and determined and courageous and passionate, you know, ladies that we've had on this podcast in these 5 episodes. And it's interesting that women particularly seem to take a real interest in that kind of caring role of nurturing and also wanting to fiercely protect the earth. Like, obviously Polly, you know, came to that conclusion in that moment in court when she looked outside the window I was hearing, and she saw the trees and she was like, why am I, you know, not why am I defending the people, but wouldn't it be nice if the earth had someone to defend them? And I thought that was a really beautiful kind of story that I heard about, that kind of, you know, like epiphany that she had that day when she gave up the barrister job and she moved into this kind of fierce protecting and defending of the earth. And I think that does seem to be quite a female thing from a lot of the conversations I've had. It's quite interesting that a lot of your team are also women. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think there's some very obvious parallels in the, you know, if you just look at, you know, you look across the sort of spectrum of, you know, every species, you know, the mother will protect their young, you know, that's the fiercest, most protective instinct that they have. And so, you know, whether or not we have children ourselves, I think that there is a very strong, you know, species wide, you know, sort of drive to protect the young, to protect the future. And yeah, so I think that's very strongly present. And you know, I know that for me, the first sort of impetus to sort of get up out of my sort of activist armchair, where I was happily signing petitions and kind of, you know, writing to MPs and actually getting kind of boots on the ground about this, came from my daughter. You know, when she overheard me talking about fracking, burst into tears and said, "But mummy, I don't understand. You know, if they're poisoning the ground, surely they know they're poisoning themselves. You've got to call them and tell them to stop." And, you know, I remember saying to her, "Well, I'm not sure how much difference it'll make if I call one of these big companies." And she said, "Well, there must be someone you can talk to." I mean, in her 5-year-old way, you know, she's like, "Well, who can you talk to?" And we'd recently been to the ballot box for the local elections, and she said, "Can't you talk to the voting man?" And so I ended up in my MP's surgery, you know, in a, you know, speaking to my local politician with my daughter in tow. And, you know, he did this classic sort of politician thing of sort of slipping away from every question that I was asking. And I remember coming out of that meeting and just thinking, that is never happening again. You know, I'm going to inform myself and, you know, really make sure that I know what I'm talking about. And this is never going to happen again. And that was really the beginning of my journey, I suppose. And again, you know, it came from that sort of response. You know, my little girl who was 5, who, you know, could clearly understand. I mean, you know, it only takes a 5-year-old to understand what's going on. You know what I mean? It seemed so insane that these levels of pollution were happening when it was so blindingly obvious that it was wrong. And I was thinking, God, this is the world she's growing up into. So I've got to do something.
I think mums, as you said, one of the key pointers in this, in terms of making the change. I mean, one of the things that I was listening to a podcast that Polly was also talking on about this idea that parents want to feed their children like the best kind of food, and that's not industrialized, agricultural, brought up and born and bred kind of food. It's like going into Stroud, going to an eco market, finding the best farmers market and getting the best kinds of produce. But some parents, you know, single mums, as she was saying, can't, you know, necessarily afford those luxuries. And of course they desperately, urgently want to make these changes and be part of that restoration that you talked about. But the number one place, I guess, that we can all do something immediately is putting the right food on the table and being part of that immediate localization change. And I think that's also, you a small thing that we can all perhaps contribute, or at least, change immediately. That's something that's within our grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so many things that we can do individually in our own lives in terms of, stepping away from the mass-produced and, the sort of polluting supply chains that are involved in so many of the products we buy. I think a lot of it is about becoming conscious. It is just about thinking about, do I really need this thing? And if I need this thing, where has it come from? And who's been involved in the making of it? And what is it potentially destroyed along the way? So don't get me wrong, it's impossible to be perfect at that in our world right now, which is why aspects like ecocide law that can act at the top level are so important, because actually, I think there's been a massive sort of triumph of the corporate PR machine over the last 20 years of making all of us feel like we're individually responsible for what's happening to the planet. Now, I don't want to say that we can't make a difference. We absolutely can. And actually, consumer pressure makes a huge difference on what corporations do. But when it comes down to it, I don't drive a fossil fuel car because I chose to. I drove it because I can't afford anything else. And that is a decision that happens at government level and at the level of the top of industry in terms of what is subsidized, what is supported and what is not supported. And therefore, what options are available to me as a citizen. And that's totally different from consumer choice. And that's why our voices are as important as our pockets and what we spend things on. It's really important what we spend things on. And I would absolutely encourage people to look at what they spend things on and to upcycle, recycle, use organic, all of those things, of course. But it's also about who you talk to, what you talk to them about, because ultimately those policy decisions are happening at the political level. And so having a conversation with your elected representative, joining the campaign group, but also, from our perspective, just talking about ecocide and making sure that as many people in your networks know about what that means, because the louder that conversation gets, the more the politicians are going to act on it. And I can say that from absolute experience, because, we have, as I say, we've got on the ground campaigns now in 12 to 15 countries. And that list, that network maps really closely onto the list of countries that are interested in ecocide and talking about ecocide. So it's not a coincidence. And it's not to do with, exactly how many people have sort of joined our campaign as members, which obviously it's wonderful if they do that, and we'd love people to do that, because apart from anything else, it also helps us get on with our work. But also what it shows is that where those conversations are happening, it's also hitting the political radar. And so never think that just having a conversation isn't powerful. It's absolutely powerful. And, we would so totally encourage people to engage politically and have those conversations. And even if you're not having them with a politician, but you're having them with your network. And so lots of different sectors are then starting to talk about ecocide. It makes a huge difference. So yeah, if you come away from this interview with one thing, talk about ecocide. Talk about stopping ecocide.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I do feel like these podcasts are actually, really kind of starting to spread the word, which is obviously, amazing. And, I found it kind of interesting that your daughter, your 5-year-old daughter, sort of took you from armchair activism. I love that. I'm definitely an armchair activism. I just like to put that out there that I'm confessing up there that's exactly what I do a lot of those sort of change.org sort of petitions. And, I probably signed about 4 only this week, actually. So that really made me laugh, that phrase. How did you go from being an armchair activist to somebody with their boots on the ground, as you put it? What was that moment apart from your daughter? What was that it?
That was the key moment, in the sense that I just kind of felt like whatever the normal information sources were, they weren't getting enough information out for people to understand what the threats were that they were potentially facing in terms of pollution. So, I guess what it meant in practice was starting to kind of look a bit more deeply, do more research, but actually starting to engage kind of on the street, if you like, I suppose. I started getting involved in local community surveys, which is one quite concretely politically impactful way to start sort of shifting opinion, where it's literally door to door, giving people information, asking them what they would want to happen in their area. And inevitably, when you actually talk to people on the ground, no, they don't want a fracking well in their backyard, but they don't necessarily know about what the implications are, for example. So it was very kind of concrete, giving talks, organising events, those kinds of things. One of the early actions I did, which was actually Polly helped me with, it was back in 2015. It was ages ago. It was when the UK government was discussing the Infrastructure Act, which did go through, sadly, but which was the one where they redefined fracking so that they could, so that it was possible to engage in it without calling it fracking. That was one aspect. And then there's another aspect that kind of mandated the government to take advantage of all hydrocarbon sources. And it was a horrific, bits of it were really, really horrific, that act. And at the time, I actually ended up personally putting on legal notice every single MP in Parliament, so 650 UK MPs, and if you do that, you have to do it by registered letter. It took the post office 10 hours to process. And but what it was sending them the information about the potential results of what they were about to vote on, and saying, you now have this information, which means that if something goes wrong, you've got prior knowledge, and you could potentially end up in court around this because you knew in advance what the potential harms were. And so, we sent all of those. And even though, obviously I've got no way of proving that it's what had the effect, but there was literally, in a few days after that, there was a flurry of changes in the politicians' support for that particular aspect. There was a whole number of MPs that started changing their minds. Now, that may or may not have been directly to do with what I did, but it was certainly, in terms of the timing, it was, it was round about that time. So it was, a whole range of things. And one of the other things that I ended up doing at the time was to do with public information. It felt like the media were not covering the results of what happens when you bring in fracking. They were talking about, I'm giving fracking as an example because that's the area I came from, but there was always talked about as a little well here or there dotted around the countryside. But when you actually looked at places where it had happened, you were talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of wells and complete industrialization of the countryside. But that wasn't being talked about in the press. And so, we crowdfunded and brought out a kind of very layperson friendly, glossy colour leaflet that went out all around the country to places that where they were thinking about licensing for fracking. And hundreds of thousands of them went out, and including to Lancashire before they took that decision way back in 2015, I think it was.
Amazing. Well done you, basically. I think a lot of people like me can sit around signing petitions and talking about these things, which is fantastic. And it's all every little helps.
Don't put it down. It's really important. Not everybody feels. And also the other thing is, the last thing I want to do is have people feeling guilty for not doing more, in the sense that, obviously, if you feel you can do more, amazing. But I think one of the things to bear in mind is that, when you talk to people one-to-one and you realise what people's values are, they're often very, very close to each other. Everybody values equality, everybody values love, everybody values safety, all of these things. And a lot of the activities that go on at the kind of corporate political level don't seem to reflect those values. But because of the way that our culture is set up, and the kind of this sort of ethic of, it's actually a sort of reality where for most people, they're having to work, 40, 50 hours a week or whatever, just to put bread on the table and feed the kids. What space is there in that for you to align your actions with your values? It's understandable if you end up kind of restricted to, clicking on petitions and, sending the occasional letter, all of which is important and is really important to do. But what I've noticed is that the people who are really making change are the ones who have the time to do it. So you've either got to have independent means, or in the case of me and Polly, we happen to have husbands who just about managed to pay the bills and support us so that we could do something without any salary, because we didn't, we weren't paid for years. I think it was only in the last year of Polly's life that we actually had enough money in the campaign to be able to actually take something as salary, because, for her for nearly 10 years and me for 4 or 5, we just didn't have any. But we had time because we were able to survive because we had partners who were paying the bills. Sometimes it might be that, I mean, you might be lucky enough to be working in the charity sector or the third sector in some way that allows you to combine, you know, earning your living with your values. And that's amazing. And then also you might be someone who's actually opted out of the system, you know, who perhaps the more that kind of stereotypical image of the activist who is not, you know, part of the system. But one of the things that allows them to do is to then take action that doesn't require them to be doing the 9-to-5 job. So however it is, you have to have that time to enable, you know, yourself to kind of actually align your actions with your values. So I think, you know, the last thing I would want to do is blame anybody. But what it does show is that our system is like a hamster wheel. Ultimately, I mean, it's funny, I had a friend that used to ask me, if you could bring in one policy tomorrow, like if you were prime minister or whatever, and you could bring in one policy tomorrow, what would it be? And I always used to kind of be weighing up between ecocide law and the universal basic income, because I kind of feel like actually the two are really, they're both super important, because if everybody knew that they had enough to survive, then they would be able to really think about what they actually wanted to be spending their time doing. And, you know, and I think that it would also shift that whole ethic around, you know, somehow if you don't have a job, you're not good enough. Or if if you're not somehow propping up this rather toxic economy, that there must be something wrong with you, you know, which is clearly nonsense. So anyway, yeah, you're teasing out my more radical elements here.
I'm loving it. And I'm sure everybody else is too. But I think, you know, you said that, you know, not all of us have the time, but the one time we do have time is when we're on holiday. And I wanted to bring this up because there's some good news going on in the Balearics, and there's a very much needed, exciting new development that's just come into play this month. I thought you might be quite impressed with this one. Since we last published this podcast, the Balearic government has banned single-use plastics from being used on all 4 of our islands. And that kicked off on March the 20th. So plastic glasses, plates, trays, cutlery, straws, coffee capsules, cotton buds, or disposable razors or lighters cannot be sold on the islands. And I just think, unfortunately, it doesn't include plastic bottles yet, because everybody here doesn't have drinkable water in the taps. And this is the heartbreak of this island, is that we don't have drinking water really fresh out of the tap. So that is an issue. But it's a start, isn't it? And I feel like, you know, even if just people listen and hear that, you know, then they're maybe going to bring their own like picnic kit or whatever when they come on holiday to Ibiza. And obviously plastic pollution is one of the things in your Ecocide campaign. So let's not, I just felt like that feels like a small little victory for the Balearics.
It's really important, because it also means that then, you know, other people can point to that and say, look, they've done it there. And so much of politics is about that. You know, it's about who's already done it. Where can we see that it's been successfully done? And, you know, so, you know, just being amongst the first, you know, the people at the forefront of doing that is just so important, being at the front of that wave, because it really allows people to come along after you. So fantastic news. That's amazing.
Yay! Well, I wanted to finish on a high, and I could chat to you for another couple of hours, but yeah, I've chewed up enough of your wonderful day, and I'm sure you've been hard at it. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really, really, really appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else does too. So on behalf of the Gang of Witches and myself, thank you for joining us, Jojo.
Thank you so much.
Tastier, healthier, happier. The future is local. Co-creating a better world is easier than you think, and it starts with grocery shopping. This month, focus on Cancel That. Cancel That is a family business with Ibizan pedigree whose 3rd generation wakes up every morning with the illusion of bringing the best products from the countryside to the homes of those who value their 0-kilometer crops. With a fruit and vegetable stall in San Antonio Market and a home delivery service that reaches every corner of the island. You will find all the information on their website www.cancelthat.com. Tastier, healthier, happier. Discover Cancel That. Make the future happen.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Jo Youle. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves.